I'm the director of the NYU Center for the Humanities, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all here tonight on behalf of our center, our staff, and our faculty director, Uli Baer. I want to thank Caroline Osi, Denny Valentin, and Soraya Bunker, and Constance Rose Edwards for their help tonight with arranging this event. This event is co-sponsored with the Archives and Public History program, and that's a master's program directed by Ellen Noonan, and I want to thank her for helping us spread the word about the event tonight. I read about Kamau Ware in the Atlantic magazine at the end of this summer. The article talked about the origins of Black Gotham experience and included photographs of people on Kamau's walking tours about the history of the African diaspora in New York. I thought to myself, I need to email him right away. He's in the Atlantic, now's the time to reach out to him and find out about a tour and a talk. You will hear more from him tonight about the origin story of his work. But there's something about it that's very powerful, this idea of how one question can change your work and change your outlook. I was particularly interested in learning more about Kamau's work because I'm teaching local and community history this fall, and we are looking at place and locality, and we are thinking about how communities tell their own histories and how to recover histories that have been overlooked. We have talked about shared authority when telling community histories, and about the importance of signage with local history, and about the differences between academic and public history. And all of these themes intersect with Kamau's work. I was fortunate recently to participate in the Other Side of Wall Street walking tour with Kamau, to learn more about the area of African-owned farms, which became known as the Land of the Blacks in 1643, where Washington Square Park stands today. Kamau has a gift for slowing down time and expanding space in order to encourage his tour participants to contemplate the lived experience of the people he's been researching. That's something that renowned historian E.P. Thompson felt was essential to social history, and Kamau is doing it today. This weekend, I was reading Anne Cheknowitz's book. It's called An Archive of Feelings. And I came across a passage which made me think about our topic tonight, and I wanted to share it with you briefly. Here's her quote. "The history of the African diaspora and slavery is not only a US one, but a transnational history of the Americas and the Black Atlantic. To return to the traumatic history of slavery and African diaspora as an explanatory context for contemporary racisms and anti-racisms is to acknowledge that this history continues to have a legacy in the present and to grapple also with an equally powerful legacy of its forgetting." So that's something for us to think about as we reflect on this evening. Tonight, Kamau will give a talk about his work, and Professor Jennifer Morgan will comment on the talk and then moderate questions and a Q&A period with all of you in the audience. I'm going to very briefly introduce both Kamau Ware and Jennifer Morgan, and then I'm going to turn the evening over to them. And please stay for the reception afterwards. We'll have a reception out front when the speaking program is over. So here are the introductions. Jennifer Morgan. Jennifer Morgan is a professor of history in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, where she serves as chair. She is the author of Laboring Women, Gender and Reproduction in the Making of New World Slavery, and the co-editor of Connections, Histories of Race and Sex in America. Her research examines the intersections of gender and race in the Black Atlantic world. Kamau Ware is a Brooklyn-based visual artist born in Pittsburgh, PA. His work focuses on visual storytelling by using photography, history, and fantasy to produce moving narratives about people and spaces. His work includes America, the Legacy of African American Legacy at the Arsenal Gallery in New York, hashtag Inside Black Gotham at Civil Service Cafe, and Exposed at the Sweet Lorraine Gallery in Brooklyn. His residencies and awards include LMCC's Process Space Program and History in Action Project. Ware received his BS from the University of Pittsburgh. Please join me in welcoming both Jennifer Morgan and Kamau Ware. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about this project and really excited to be able to be in to have a conversation between the sort of academic and the public history. I think I'm looking forward to it.
Good evening. How are we doing? Good. All right, excellent. That was actually a good response. Sometimes I get stared at like it's not a real question, but it is. And you have to consider that a lot of times my wheelhouse is having literally moving conversations that are interactive. There's conversations happening, And as much as I enjoy getting out and giving these different kind of talks, it's still very sometimes weird to like just have an entire room just like stare at you for an hour or 30 minutes, because on a walking tour you kind of like have moments to like stop and have conversation. So I just want you to feel as comfortable as possible, and I might pause every now and then for like a burning question or burning comment, even though we're going to have a Q&A later on, just to like make sure that the room has energy. Sound good? All right, fantastic. So I don't have notes. That's not me bragging. That's me telling you I might ramble every now and then, but it'll all make sense. That's kind of how walking tours often are. They're walking conversations. There is a script of sorts. There's notes, of course, but a lot of what happens on our walking tours is based on a conversation. And our basic definition for Black Gotham Experience is we are a visual storytelling project that celebrates the impact of the Black diaspora on New York City. And so I want to show you some examples of how our project has come into fruition and what it's doing right now, and bring you more or less up to date and begin to work backwards. And so, if anybody's been downtown lately, Lower Manhattan, anybody seen these kiosks on Water Street and Gouverneur Lane? And so we basically have had an opportunity to work with Lower Manhattan Cultural Council and the Department of Transportation to begin to put these kiosks on the street, which are parts of our graphic novel project that's in the process of being completed. But part of how this came about is we move through public spaces on a regular basis. And the public square is a way of looking at like media, but it's concretized, and it's always giving you messages and signals. And sometimes those messages are subtle, sometimes they're loud, and a lot of times they're like not even noticed, but they're very powerful. And so when you're doing something as simple as walking through the public square, often when you do some research, you realize how uneven that conversation is, how much history is not talked about, how much information is not being presented, and how much there is a clear agenda to elevate certain stories over others, the same way a particular TV channel or news channel might operate. It's almost like one network has programmed our public square. And if you walk through the public square, it's kind of like, okay, this is reality. And that has a very big impact on how you see the world, but it's often not necessarily true. And a lot of times it's mythologized and it leans a particular way. And so to be able to be a part of the public square is amazing, to have these, pieces of artwork up on the street. But I just want to also just encourage everybody, it's a very early on thing as a takeaway, is walk around your city, ask questions. Questions are very powerful, and the human being is a very powerful thing. And by asking questions and walking through space, you'll find out there's so much you can discover with or without the aid of anybody else, just by Googling, going to the library, and finding out what used to be there versus what's there in front of you right now. And so this is like a bit of a dark image, but you might be able to tell there's kind of like some fun happening there. Perhaps you can tell. This is our Nerdy Thursday event, and we're actually having a little Nerdy Thursday after party today. If anybody wants to show up, it's in the Seaport District. It's free, so I'm not trying to sell you anything. But one thing that's important about how Black Gotham Experience has manifested is we're talking about slavery. We're talking about trauma. We're talking about things that are very serious and deep and powerful. But at the same time, there's a levity to us being able to talk about it because it's all pent up. Like, we all want to have these conversations, but there isn't enough outlets to really discuss it in a way that's meaningful and inclusive and has depth. And so when you get people in the same space and time who've had a walking tour and they've leaned into it from an emotive standpoint, and then it can have conversations, have some cocktails, hear some music, it's like, wow, we're actually having a good time. But that's kind of like, it feels like therapy. It feels like we actually needed to have this conversation, and it's so good that we're having it, because that pent up sensation of not talking about it, it's something you don't quite realize is there until you begin to actually have the real conversation. And so I just want to also just, offer some other things to think about is, if you're not having conversations that deal with the complex and traumatic pieces of identity that we all have inherited as citizens of the world, in particular citizens of our own country here. If you're a US citizen, it's worth breaking that wall down. You'll feel a lot better. Whatever you might be holding back that make you feel uncomfortable about it, go there. You'll feel better. And so this is a walking tour at night. Our walking tours are usually at night. Something about the moon and the darkness and the shadows and people like not being as busy creates a great environment to have a conversation. And the thing that I want to really impress upon you as we move forward is how much this is a communal, collective process. And this is a lot more successful because it's not about me. And one thing that I am proud of is that I've been able to make this not about myself, but on the walking tour, make it very much about your individual personal experience as I guide you through a path to begin to consider things that perhaps you have not thought about, or also begin to populate parts of your imagination that are missing because the powers that be in the past several centuries did not want you to think about those stories. And one way we do that is something extremely simple. It's a little bit of technology. It's called paper. It's been around for a couple days. And we just print people's names on them. This card is Paulo de Angola. This one is Christina Angola. They actually lived in this neighborhood where we are right now. And by giving people a card, we ask them to begin to use the information provided, the setting, to create a world in their own imagination that can help them understand that particular person's lived experience. And so that's not necessarily, let's go run to the library, put on some white gloves and dig into the archives, which is fascinating. It's always fun to go and find out, things you might not know and get to the raw material. But it's also something very powerful and liberating about being able to just ask questions and imagine and approach history with a form of play that allows you to get past the archives, because sometimes the conversation is dictated by what's been collected, and if it's not collected, people don't talk about it, or somehow the merit is not there. And that's not necessarily a wrong thing, but it's just part of the practice of academia, about proving your point, about having merit, is to be able to always pinpoint down to something that is super old that says this happened. But this is also something that can be used in tandem with that entire practice, where it's okay to ask questions and to infer and move beyond what's available in front of you, because that's part of how we all learn, because no matter what's presented in front of you, you still have to drift from that at some point in time and fill in the blanks. Am I making sense yet, or am I crazy? We good? Y'all bored yet? All right, just checking. And so this is not a walking tour, but pretend like we are. Imagine we're all moving through time and space. One thing that is a very important part of how these stories are created, and I'm going to work my way into The Other Side of Wall Street specifically, which is the first graphic novel series coming out of the project, which leans into the stories that begin in 1625 in the outpost known as New Amsterdam, part of the Netherlands, part of the project of the West India Dutch Company during a time of war. And one of the things that I have done that I think might be different than a normal practice, being a visual thinker, being an artist first and foremost, who became a historian by sheer nerd hours, is you begin to connect these dots and puzzle pieces. Because I'm a visual thinker, I have to see it. If I can see it, I can understand it. If I don't see it, I have to find a way to see it. And one of the things that has been fun and almost like solving a mystery is connecting all these disparate dots that all tell this story about the Black diaspora, which has always been something fascinating to me since I was a child. And sometimes, awkward in classrooms when you're like the one Black kid in the 5th grade, or the Black kid in both 6th grades, or you're talking about family history and you don't quite know what to say, and your teacher hasn't quite protected you in that situation, and you feel really awkward. That stays with you. That discomfort does not go away. I still feel it. I've been in many situations where everybody's like, yeah, we're going to talk about family history. And look at me like, what do you know? And like the teacher, putting me on blast. I don't know everything, And so I'm real big on connecting the dots. And when I began to find out more about the Black experience, I found out it was really interesting. And not to go a complete tandem, but anybody here watch Game of Thrones? I see some hands going up. Anybody here see Blade Runner 2049? More hands. All right. Anybody here watch Gladiator? No Russell Crowe fans? My man in the back? Word. So for me, if I'm watching Game of Thrones, I'm watching about the Unsullied and the breaking of trains and talking about slavery, and it's yeah, that's a Black story. Yeah, I read about that. Or if I'm watching Blade Runner, these replicants are fighting back. They're tired of being enslaved. It's yeah, I get that. Like there's all these different like ways that stories that involve these very important human components of the Black diaspora that often aren't like teased out or talked about, but they're put into movies and represented differently. And so I've always found the Black stories fascinating, and part of what I like to do is connect these dots. And so here's one thing I want to present for you as we begin to get into the historical context of Other Side of Wall Street. So I'm beginning to pivot here. Y'all with me? All right, so one thing that often is not connected is the discovery of New York with war. Does anybody here associate Henry Hudson, the discovery of New York, with war? Anybody? It's kind of disconnected. Does anybody connect the discovery of New York with the Congo and Angola? Are those, I mean, it's okay to like nod or whatever? Okay, all right. So how about connecting New York City with the slave trade? Yeah, I'm seeing more head nods. Yeah. Cool. All right. And so part of what I've begun to do, which might be review for some people here, is look at how from the very outset, the 80s Years' War takes a pause, and it's 1609. They send Henry Hudson off to try to find a faster route to India because the oceans are not major battle points at that moment in time. He discovers the harbor, but the thing about that is the truce just ended, and now they're ready to find an outpost to begin to attack Portuguese slave ships because the Netherlands are revolting against the Spanish, and the Spanish have a contract called Asiento with the Portuguese, and they're doing most of the principal slave trading. And sometimes you find these weird discussions between the Spanish and Portuguese about who was actually doing the slave trading. Anybody ever had this kind of conversation before? They're really fascinating. They're like, no, you did it. No, you did it. It's like, really? You both did it. Deal with it. It's history, it's facts. But it's interesting to consider that before this war pops off in 1568, with the Dutch revolting against the Spanish and using piracy to attack these slave ships and treasure fleets as a means of war, there's already some tension bubbling up in the Congo, which is in West Africa. And these two wars are going to intersect on the Atlantic Ocean in a very epic, interesting way that's going to bring some of the first boatloads of Black people to this island. And the reason why the Dutch were here in the first place is because they heard about Henry Hudson's failed excursion to the east, where he discovered beavers and timber over here in the harbor. And so if that war wasn't happening, there wouldn't have been a truce or a moment to send Henry Hudson on this journey to the east. And so this journey connects back to the Dutch that are attacking Portuguese slave ships, that kicks the war back off right around the same time they're invading Portugal, not Portugal, but invading Brazil, to wrest that from the Portuguese. And so the ocean over here in the middle, before the transatlantic slave trade, is like something that is involving the French and the English. At some point in time, is principally the Portuguese working with the Spanish, and there's not a whole lot of competition, except for being raided by an occasional pirate that's Dutch. Follow me? So the ocean is this amazing, interesting intersection of warfare, commerce, and culture that has these implications, such as developing this place called New Amsterdam, which is part of New Netherlands, which becomes our city of New York. And often those things aren't connected. And here we have, to our left, a guy who changed his name to João, based off a Portuguese king. We're now getting into the African story that is going to intersect with the 80s Years' War that begins in 1568, but this goes back to 1491. In 1491, the Portuguese are bringing their Jesuits into the Congo, not for a violent takeover, but a cultural takeover. And people are accepting Catholicism and changing their names to names like João and Afonso, which are popular, well-respected Portuguese kings of the Catholic faith. And what this begins to create is this culture of people leaving the Congo and Angola, well, actually not Angola yet, that are more or less paying a fee to the Portuguese for providing them with civilization and churches, etc. And so what I'm trying to establish here is that where we are right now is going to all begin to be like a connecting point for all these stories, because these Black bodies that's going to come from the Congo and Angola about Portuguese slave ships attacked by the Dutch during warfare are going to end up right here in this neighborhood as free Black farmers, or quote unquote legally half free, and their stories is nowhere I mean, everything I'm telling you right now that can make a great Game of Thrones season 9 is not acknowledged anywhere in the public square where we are right now. Anybody have any wild guesses why that's not the case? How come we don't hear about this? Can you imagine this being like a Pilgrim story? You think you'd hear about it? Probably so. This is our buddy Afonso, and behind him is Angola. We've all heard of Congo and Angola, right? Part of how you get Angola is because Afonso's son, Alvaro, has a difficult time becoming the official king of the Congo, and he invites the support of the Portuguese military. And once they assist him in becoming the king, they then begin to partition out the southern part of the kingdom of the Congo. And so you're going to have this tension between the Congo and Angola going on at the same time. You have this 80s years war where you basically have people that are Calvinists revolting against the Catholic Habsburg family, and every now and then the French and English get involved on our side, leading up to the ending of the Armada by Queen Elizabeth. All these things you might hear about because that's the European side of the story, but below Europe, there's a big continent called Africa, and there's a story that's happening like a split screen that's going to intersect with that story, that's going to bring that chapter right here to the development of New Amsterdam that's going to become New York City. And part of what we want to do is create the visuals for that story, because one thing that's missing are a body of images that tell the Black story. You'll see a number of ones that show things that might be more familiar. This is Queen Nzinga. Anybody ever heard of her? Just by a quick show of hands, I'm super curious now. I saw like a nod. Queen Nzinga, amazing warrior queen of Angola. I just told you part of the backstory of Angola and the Congo. Once Angola does get partitioned, they're fighting against the slave trade. She's leading her own people into battle, and she's fighting until like her 70s, 80s. She's like a major, if I can use the A word, kick-ass queen. Can I say that? And part of what's going to happen with her story is, once again with that split screen, while she's fighting against the Portuguese in Angola, the Dutch are also beginning to plot with her to assist her in fighting against a common enemy. They're not concerned about her race. They're like, hey, you don't like them, we don't like them, we all friends. And then while that's happening over here in New Amsterdam, you're also having some of the first Black marriages of people who come from Angola. And so once again, visual, split screen, warrior queen in Angola, working with the Dutch. At the same time, Dutch people are giving Black folks here from Angola the ability to become, married and have, families. So another part of the story. But what we have here is actually a photograph that was created to look like an old print. I shot this like last summer, but I want to make it look like something that was created in the past. And so this is one way of beginning to understand how we're using the artistic and academic process to create these artifacts that are missing. And that's part of what's really fun about this project, is that we're having a discourse and making the conversation of artifacts a conversation right now. Not just something that happened in the past, but how can we begin to speak to this time period and say out loud, you missed a spot. There's part of the stories that are not there. And it's very empowering, and it's also very fun, and it's also very necessary, because without the visuals, once again, the conversation often doesn't happen. Anybody know what's going on here? Who's seen this before? You've seen it? This is Peter Minuit, 1626, allegedly buying Manhattan. Doesn't quite purchase the island in the way that we think about it, even though that's how it's been recorded. I think there's a pretty significant debate about what it meant to purchase Manhattan during a culture of people giving gifts and staying in the same space and time as everybody else. I often compare it to like bringing wine to a dinner party and like taking the house. And I often present this image as well. And if you've been on a walking tour, you've probably seen this exercise where I often challenge people to say, hey, just quickly, who in this image has like the highest rank? And 9 times out of like 9, people say, oh, the white guy, which is like, of course. But if you like look at it carefully, you begin to look at her clothes and his clothes and see that her shoes are better. She's wearing a corset. Her hat's better. Her body language is more empowering. He's more in deference. His chin is lower. His gaze is lower. And it's like, whoa. Okay, maybe the Black woman or woman of color actually is of higher authority than he does. But our gaze has often already been curated to an extent that we can't even tell that she's clearly the person with the higher ranking in that image. but then still behind her, you have people that are enslaved. And so this particular artist is showing some really interesting dynamics in New Amsterdam that's not necessarily easy to get at first glance. You have different tiers of people of color. You have this woman behind her who has like no shirt on at all. And then you have her nice and tall, and then you still have the person of European descent, a smidgen smaller than her, but based on the fashion, she clearly is a person who has a little more rank than he does. Can you all see that? I'm seeing someone shaking her head no. All right, one more time. Because if you look at the way the people behind her are depicted, their etching is like a little bit darker. There's like a depth of field play going on. But if you like look at the first two people who are in the foreground, look at her hair, how more curly it is than the person next to her. Look at her lips. And what you see is like there is a lot more like a fuller lip, a broader nose, and like a curlier hair. And the etching compared to those behind her are a bit darker than she is, but she's clearly darker than the person to her left. And so art is one thing you can interpret on your own. And so I can't just say she's black, end of the story, but I say she's a person of color based upon how color is depicted between the gradient of the person to her left and those behind her. And I would say that based on her skin complexion, based on what says about an artist, is she's somewhere in between the man and those behind her. So yeah. So does that answer? I mean, you'll have to agree, but did I answer your question at least? Thank you. And so this is a representation of somebody who might be that woman. I don't know who this person is. I found her fascinating. But in 1641, you are beginning to have your first black marriages. One of them is a woman named Catalina who lived close by here, close where the IFC is. And what I've done to begin to try to flesh her story out is I have found somebody who I feel makes me think of how that person might have been. And so this is a photograph of her to the left. We can kind of see her skin tone. And then to the right is one that looks more like it was produced through an etching style. And by doing that, we're going back in time and beginning to say, let's flesh this person's story out and do as much research as we can to get as much of her story as possible. But we now can begin to have some representation of one of the first black landowners of New Amsterdam, or of the Netherlands. Her name was Catalina de Angola, or Catalina from Angola. And so this is one way we can use art and creativity to begin to walk into the conversation of history and actually make the artifacts a conversation and expand the story and give us visuals to have a conversation. And if you look over here, this is, anybody know the guy in the middle with the peg leg? He's pretty popular. Peter Stuyvesant, yep. And if you look over here to the left, there's some guy with an afro. Not sure who that person is, but if you look at the black people that were in New Amsterdam at the time, you can almost get down to a possible set of names that it might be. It might be, Manuel de Gerrit de Roos, who was actually there when he was, being challenged, because part of what's happening in New Amsterdam is there's this push of people who have settled here who want more rights, because it starts off as a company. And at the company level, it's like, this guy's the boss. What he says goes, and that's it. But people who've been here for a while are like, yeah, but you're making some weird decisions. You're attacking the First Nations. You're creating these wars. We have no say. There's no council. And so there's a push to say we have to expand our rights. And part of black people beginning to become landowners is part of the best way to look at the example that people want, which is we need more rights. We need a more expansive set of freedoms. And so I'm not quite sure who this guy is over here in the corner, but we have an idea of what kind of person that might be, but you still begin to see some representation of people from the Pitaminwi drawing of First Nations to the image of the black woman or woman of color. And this person over here also in this Stuyvesant image down by Stadthuis, which becomes the city hall. And so when you look at, this is the Costello plan. Who's seen this before? A few people? I love this map. I love maps. And one of the things that begins to happen when the first black bodies are brought here from that pirate ship, it's a time when there isn't a formal, determined legal status of slavery in New Amsterdam, in New Netherlands. And the people that are coming from Angola and the Congo have seen laws passed, agreements made. They have seen for over a century what happens when you're having conversations about rights and placement and language and culture, and they're beginning to negotiate early on for their freedom. And some of the first things that they do when they first arrive is complete the fort, which is over here on the bottom left or to the middle. They're also charged with building up the Broadway, which we still have Broadway. And there's a number of other and very important things that we still have today, like Wall Street. That's also going to happen like in the first 20 or so years of New Amsterdam. And many of the people who are doing these public works come from Angola and the Congo. And many of them are going to also become landowners right here where we are right now. So it's a very amazing continuity of people where we know where they came from, we know their names, we know what they had to build, and we know when people become landowners in the 1640s, 50s, and also 60s. And so there's a very interesting continuity of a story, but it just hasn't been represented in a way that's visual, that people can really begin to sink their eyeballs into. And we do it with the walking tour, but by having the visuals, it makes the conversation totally different. And so by having a graphic novel that can touch different eyeballs and be a kinesthetic experience, we believe that is something that has artistic validity, but also scholarship and academic heft to it as well. But then it's also something that can affect, just about everybody. We all have heard of Spider-Man and Batman and, the Marvel universe, and we're probably all excited to see Black Panther, right? And so I think if we begin to take some of the stories that exist now, and yes, it's not the same as a walking tour because we can have a little more fun with it because it can be historic fiction, but with footnotes and a bibliography and tell you what's fact and what's not. But I think it's important for people to understand, especially New Yorkers, that the foundation of our city was built by people who have a very specific location, not the abstract Africa, but the Congo and Angola. And so now here we are. I'm gonna fast forward a bit. We're now in British New York. One of my favorite questions to ask people. Anybody here been on a walking tour before? A Black Gotham walking tour specifically? 1, 2, 3, 4. Hello, friends. Good to see you again. So here's my question I love to ask, it's an honest question. If you think about what you've seen of New York history, the first 100 years, 1664, September 9th, is when the deal was signed between Richard Nichols coming on behalf of James Stewart to take the town under threat of violence from the Dutch. And then it becomes New York City, flag changes. And then if we go forward 1 decade, 2 decades, all the way to 100 years, going to 1764, what have you seen in media, pop culture, or artifacts that give you a sense of what that first 100 years was like as a lived experience? And when I say lived experience, here goes some examples. We've already seen some. This is a drawing from the time period of New Amsterdam. This is a drawing, and here's another one. Think about the first 100 years of New York. What have you seen outside of maps or portraits of wealthy people that give you a sense of how New York looked and felt as a lived experience? I'll give you guys an entire 60 seconds. And raise your hand if you have something, or if you want to keep thinking and wait till the last 10 seconds. Yes, sir. Are there people in the engraving? Okay, so it's kind of like the Burgess view. It's a landscape, right? Cool, perfect. Thank you. Anybody else? Don't be afraid. It's all good. He's not going to win a prize. You're not going to get kicked out. It's low stakes, but often it is quiet because there isn't a lot. And to think that all we have is an engraving that doesn't really show human interaction is principally a landscape like the Burgess view that gives you a sense of the space, but doesn't give you a sense of interactivity. Like all the ones that I've shown you so far have some diversity in them as far as ethnicity. But if you think about it, New York is going to also continue to be a very diverse location, a very strong Black population, the biggest Black population outside of Charleston, South Carolina. And black people in slavery are going to continue to have a major role in the development of New York City, to the extent that New York City is named after the person who was the primary shareholder in the Royal African Trading Company. So New York City, surprising to most people, is named after a slave trader, not necessarily a king, which is why it's called, New York. From the Duke of York, who him and his brother created a slave trading company and needed New York City to be its commercial hub. During a time when they're beginning to say this is how we're going to become an empire, is using slave trade money and sugar money. And so we often put everything down on the South and say that's where slavery happened. But before you even have a cotton gin invented in 1801, or 1802, you already have sugar, which is a major, major, major moneymaker that's going to help England become a global empire. And New York City, named after James Stewart, is one of the main holdings of that company and leverage points. And we have one engraving in the room that, unless you have anything else you want to share, by and large is kind of like a missing story. Would you guys agree? Isn't that a little bizarre to have an entire century of New York that's going to become our nation's first capital, a very important site of the American Revolution, completely missing all this information? Isn't that kind of strange? Doesn't seem strange? Think about Philadelphia or Boston or Virginia or the Pilgrims. I mean, we have a lot of other cities that have important roles in American history, and we could basically, you could probably Google it right now and find some images of people like in Boston or Philadelphia or Virginia. But for some reason, you get to New York and you're missing a lot of information. I think part of it is because artifacts do make you think about what happened. The same way popular culture also can make you think about what took place and what's the implications. But similar to the public square, our minds are also very important parts of how we think and how we behave. Like we're all like individual states. And as we walk through the public square and we see certain things and don't see certain things, it's the same thing when it comes down to media. And so what I'm trying to tease out is that our project is looking at having a conversation about what is talked about and what's not talked about. And as you can begin to imagine right now, we at least have a century of history that's missing, that needs to be a part of our conversation to understand not just our history as New Yorkers, but this is the beginning of where the Bill of Rights is written. George Washington takes his oath of office, and what happened before the Revolution is all critical parts of the story. You follow me? You don't got to agree, but do you follow my thinking? So, who's seen this painting? This is around Evacuation Day. You see anybody in here look brown or see many women in this? See a woman over here on the side. Yeah. 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 You think anybody black fought in the American Revolution based on this picture? Ooh. Native American in the corner. Nice. Kind of like bowing down a little bit. So once we get to like the 1800s, we're like creating images that tell the story of America's beginnings in New York City as where Federal Hall is going to be, or our government's going to basically, be housed before going to Philadelphia, before going to DC. And we begin to like see images become, a bit whiter and whiter, even though you had one of the first big migrations of black bodies happens during the Revolution, because the Howe brothers are the first ones to say, actually, we can have black troops. If you fight on the side of the British, you can become free after the war is over. And New York City's black population more than doubled, more than tripled. Lots of black bodies in New York. You come to this painting and it's like, where's the black people? Who's seen this image crossing the Delaware? This is another interesting situation because this painting is actually commissioned almost a century after the actual original crossing of the Delaware. And the person who commissioned this image is actually an abolitionist. And what they wanted to do was make sure that the telling of America and Revolution included people of color and also women. And if you look at this painting carefully, there's a woman in the boat. Anybody ever notice where she is? She's right here in the front and she's rowing. And right behind her is a black person also rowing. And so already, not the 1900s yet, you already have artists and people commissioning, we're already beginning to get our story wrong. Let's have somebody commission a painting that shows Washington crossing the Delaware, and inside that boat showed that more people in there besides, white men fighting for this idea of freedom, this idea of America. And if you think about some of the conversations we're having today in this country, it's like a remix. It's like the same dialogue. Whose country is it? Like everybody wasn't involved in making America a better place back in the day or fighting for the idea of freedom. And I don't want to get too deep down that rabbit hole, but I want to talk about how important it is to have a conversation with history and to walk into that conversation with purpose. And we're doing it, but I don't want, like I said, I think we're successful because we don't make it about just ourselves. I want to also encourage everybody when you're studying history to consider how can you be in conversation with that time period, because artifacts are not just things that are old. We all have artifacts on you right now. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I would say that the thing about art I love the most is you catch different things on a regular basis, which is why I say, am I walking towards this conversations? I learn stuff all the time. But yeah, the definitely woman over there in the red, and then she's probably the one I'm actually meant to go to first. I kind of lost my orientation, but the black guy's right there. But often you might see this painting like not. Who's ever noticed that before? Just curious. Who saw it for the first time today? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. It's like the Da Vinci Code, right? Art's that way. Who's ever heard of the 1741 Near Conspiracy or the Great Negro Plot? It's an interesting story, right? Right there on Wall Street is where you had the actual court case. And I bring this up because here goes the Delaware, here goes Evacuation Day. And so we're going from 1783 during the Revolution. This happened 1741. There's not much popular culture or reproductions or artifacts that talk about this court case that went on for almost 6 months in 1741. And as it says here, it's a conspiracy formed by some white people in conjunction with Negro and other slaves. And if you begin to read the primary source material of this actual court case, what you see is this beginning of a culture of mixed company, different races of a similar class, drinking and complaining and talking about, their status in life and how they want to change it and are willing to do it through violent means and create a new society and give a new governor and a new king a role to create a new society. And this is 20, 30 years before we're beginning to actually have a spill out of open rebellion known as the American Revolution, about 20 years plus before the Stamp Act is passed. And this is part of what I want people to think about when it comes down to storytelling, because storytelling it's amazing. It's the problem and the solution. How stories are told often can make us think things happen one way, but then by telling a story appropriately, you begin to expand your idea of what actually would have took place. You follow? So I really want to encourage people to check this particular story out. This is not the topic for the night necessarily, but I want to begin to show you as we get into the future of our story how many things we have to consider that might look different than how we imagined they may have been. This is also part of the same document. And so I want to pause for a second and just talk about why I ended up even doing what I do, because I lean forward very much with asking questions and having conversations and asking for insight, because the reason why I do this is because I was asked a question that changed my life. And I think it's really important to be humble and be flexible, because you're always going to get more information and get more out of life when you're not so rigid and tight. At least that's been true for my life. And when I watch other people hold on to the point of view so tightly that they can't necessarily ever imagine what you're talking about, they're always thinking what to say next. And I was actually giving a tour that I felt very passionate about. It was a tour called Getting By at the museum known as the Tenement Museum in the Lower East Side. And I began working there in 2007, moved here in 2006. And it was a school group on a Monday. And I'm talking about this, German Jewish family. There's a woman named Natalie Gumpertz whose husband disappears. She has 4 kids, and she decides to become a seamstress. And I found her story so resilient, you know, that she's able to like find a way to like take care of her family. She loses one of her children. Her husband never returns. And it's like some of the beginning of like people sewing in tenements. And so I feel connected to it as a human story. And then I'm talking about an Italian family who's around during the Depression, you know, right before the Depression, and how they almost couldn't get into the country because of eugenics. And talking about race was, you know, a very interesting conversation for me to have with people from all over the world and in America. But this particular day I'm giving this tour in 2008, I'm not considering that I'm a black person talking to a black school group, and there's 3 girls on the tour the entire time who never ask a question, who kind of like throw shade real respectfully, and like a real subtle stink eye, like. I'm trying my best to engage them the same way I'm, you know, taking questions from you when you have them. It's important to have discourse, and I couldn't get a question out of them, and I was trying my best. And then at the end of the tour, you finally get one of their hands to go up, and so I like rush into that moment, like, yes, what's your question? And she's just like, where are the black people? And I was just like, damn. I didn't say damn. I was like, right. Yeah, like, and it was so obvious to her, less obvious to me, but that made me want to address that discomfort I had by being in a situation where I wasn't even considering myself necessarily as a person that was black talking to black students. I'm just like, hey, I'm an educator. Nothing wrong with that. I don't think that I was a bad person. You know, that wasn't a terrible situation. But she was so right, and I'm so glad she found her voice and challenged me in that moment, because that sent me digging, that sent me looking. And so part of our entire project is honoring the question, honoring the discourse, honoring the insight that comes out of 2 people having an honest conversation. And part of what is inspiring our creative process is that kernel of humility and creativity and community, because we're looking at our project is not just one thing one particular person does, but it spills out into the creative process. And I want to talk about that as we wrap up, because this is me giving my very first walking tour when I had less hair. Joke. That's 2010. And that's my first walking tour. It was like 3-hour plus tour. And I was trying 3 centuries of history. I can do it. Let's go. And I was like, all right, it's too much. So I began to break it down into like different segments and sections. And, you know, as a person who like loves trilogies and Star Wars, like, all right, we're going to break it down into 3 different stories. Other Side of Wall Street, Caesar Rebellion, Citizen Hope. Boom. And now I had to break down 2 of those stories into 2 other tours, because there's so much content and I want to give people time to think and participate in the conversations. And so I want to show you some slides that show you how this idea of participation is making manifest in the graphic novel project. And so let me give you this actually, my man, sure. Actually, William, before the lights go down, raise your hand, bro. This is my creative partner over there, Williams. He's an illustrator, designer, working with me on the project. And he, this piece he did completely on his own somewhere in Brooklyn in the dark of night. This is our representation of that slave ship we talked about before that's going to get raided by Dutch pirates. And part of how we're depicting these stories is, even though it is a dark and in a sad moment, we're beginning to like look at people's lives and their souls and their dreams while they're in these kind of conditions. Because regardless of what kind of conditions we find ourselves in, part of who we are as human beings is so much bigger than our flesh. And we're looking at finding ways to animate that and make it visceral, and then make it something that is also inclusive. And so here's an example. This is an image of a person. His name is Charles, but he's playing the role of Domingo. And he's actually a stylist from Chicago who's hilarious. He's funny. He goes to Afropunk every year and tries to like slay the entire thing. He loves clothes. But when he talks about being Domingo and carrying that story forward, I have noticed just how that affects him as a person and the level of pride he has when he talks about Black Gotham and invites people to be a part of our events or our walking tours. And once again, that's me not making it about me. It's like, you know what? I need you to be Domingo. I need you to step into this process and carry that story forward. And then I'll do the photography, I'll do the writing, and then I get a chance to work with somebody else who's amazing and creative and work on the design and the layout. And so similar to being on a walking tour where everybody in that conversation is a part of the process, we want our graphic novel to also be similar and engage more than one person and more than one kind of personality and make the story more inclusive and also deeper. And this is my friend Sada, and she might know her from Everyday People or see around. She's like in ads nowadays, but she's super cool, very humble. And I asked her to play the role of an angel who's speaking to somebody during this journey across the ocean to consider what's it like to be contemplating death, contemplating your next day, and what might you think about, because imagine your sleep cycle if you're on a slave ship for like 3-4 months. You probably don't just go to bed at nighttime. What is night, what is day? You might fall asleep any point in time and imagine that you're free and wake up and you're back in chains. And so I'm asking her, can you step in and be like this very important spiritual character in the story? And so we're opening up the process and making it something that can be communal. So by the time we finish one book, you might have affected 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10 other people. And so this is how you begin to intersect the academic process of doing the research, but also a way of bringing history and art together that creates a very powerful moment, because these are not just images. This also is an artifact that represents our current time. This is an example of a character who's having a vision of a wolf that he would not have seen in Angola, but once he gets over here to Manhattan, you're going to see bears and panthers and wolves. And this particular character, Domingo, is going to have this ongoing visitation of a wolf while he's on his way to what he thinks is going to be Brazil, but they're going to be raided by pirates and end up in Manhattan. And part of him having these visions of a wolf helps him connect to some of the First Nations, because he's not afraid of the wolf when he finally sees it. But part of what you have here, which of course is historic fiction, is imagining what's it like if you are Domingo, who is a real person, who ends up in New Amsterdam, ends up becoming a landowner, ends up getting married, and even buying somebody else's daughter so they can have freedom in 1663, but following that person's journey and imagining what that person might have experienced while they're going to God knows where. And this is us also trying to figure out, you know, when the Portuguese are showing up in the late 1400s, they're going to convert people to Catholicism, and people who are actually on these slave ships are going to speak Portuguese and Congo, and then be raided by Dutch pirates who are Protestant, Calvinists. What's that like to try to figure out what you believe in when you're now in a whole new world and you understand the social mobility of who you are and how you move forward has a lot to do with not your skin color, but how you believe in God. Because part of the whole 80 years war is fought over Catholicism versus Calvinism. And so I think that's a very important part of teasing out the complexity of the lived experience, is to imagine, what do people believe in? Just by show of hands, how many of you would question your religion just maybe once or twice if the people who gave you your religion are the same ones driving a slave ship? Anybody? You're not going to get struck down by lightning by raising your hand. It's okay. But once again, making it something that you can relate to. And part of what we're doing with this book that's similar to giving out a card on a walking tour is making it very much about dreams and that paper door between dream and death that exists, because we're all lucky to come back from our dreams and come back to reality. But it's something that everybody can imagine. We're all going to dream tonight, God willing. We're all going to go to bed. And so by having this graphic novel story as a very important part of the beat is always considering, how does your day affect your dreams, and how do your dreams affect your choices and your actual tangible aspirations that we all call dreams? So it's a way for us to like turn these pages, but also begin to imagine our own humanity. How am I doing on time, Gwen? Fantastic. And so this right here shows a passage of time moving across the ocean. And this is something you would see if you ever came down to our seaport space on 192 Front Street. And what we're doing here is something real simple. We're taking an image that was created in 2016 and blending it with the Costello plan of 1660 to begin to have a conversation about this notion, other side of Wall Street, people who actually helped build up Wall Street, the Fort, and the Broadway, who then fight and push to become a free people who established this town that basically, or this community that's going to exist between the West and also the East Village, close to where we are right now, actually where we are right now. going from one side of the island to the other, to begin to consider their lived experience and what we can learn from them and how important it is that we acknowledge their story. And so going back to how I got started, we think it's important to make sure it's a communal, collective, fun process. And by having a space where we do our photography and have our conversations, we think it's a great time to say, hey, let's just talk about the creative process, look at the artwork, and once again, had some levity to it, where it's not like it's funny, but it's like, hey, we're talking about history. We're talking about how we're all connected. If you're alive in this room, somewhere in your past, somebody was in the 1600s, 1500s, 1700s. We might not know who that particular person was, but to begin to come together and talk about this shared history that touches so many parts of the world, we're beginning to all be a part of a conversation that makes us feel more connected, more united, more a part of the same story. And so storytelling is something that can be a part of the solution in that sense, where we have more connectivity. And I think it's very necessary, specifically right now where we are. It's always necessary, but I get I don't want to say agitated, but I just don't like the broken record conversation we keep having about who belongs here, who doesn't belong here, when diversity and different types of people and stories have always been what's made this nation what it is. But a lot of that's because how the story is told. You would think it's only one particular person or group that makes America what it is, and that's never been the case. And so you all know where this is. Who walked by this today? A few people. So I want you to think about something. What we're doing with this particular project is not an isolated incident. You have more and more people challenging and questioning curriculum, questioning the gaze of history, asking how they're represented in stories. And right now, there is no place that identifies the people who lived in this area. And I always find it amazing and interesting to have a conversation or a walking tour with people who are at New York University, whether it's graduate students or senior faculty or it's undergrads, because these stories are right here. You're almost like indirect stewards of the spaces that I would consider sacred, because this is where a lot of the real identity that we celebrate so much, freedom, pursuit of happiness, community, working together, getting rid of slavery, all those stories happened right here on this campus, but hundreds of years ago. And I think that there's a very special opportunity for anybody part of the New York University community to begin to consider, how do you embrace these stories? And it's also worth considering, it's not about tearing anything down. There's nothing that's offensive to say, hey, we hate that statue. But you have a chance to consider what might be built up, what might need to go in the place of where certain things are not being talked about. And so that's one thing I want to leave you with, New York University, because I think that that's something that makes life very interesting, is to be a part of the conversation, a part of history, not just receiving information, especially one-sided information, but opening yourself up, leading with questions, and then deciding that you're not going to just be a passive participant with life, but actually be a part of the conversation. And so on that note, I thank you all for your time.
So I think I have to start out by saying that I'm a little mad that I have not been on this walking tour and that I am only just meeting you now and hearing about this amazing work. And I think I also have to say that we're going to be knowing each other now, because I have so many things that I want to talk to you about. But I'm not gonna hog, even though I have the mic. I'm not gonna hog the mic. I'm
thrilled to be speaking with you. I'm a fan.
Well, it's total mutual right now. So I think I'm just going to start with a few things that came to mind as you were talking. Some about the history that you're engaged with, and also, but some about the archive project that you're engaged with. And so I'm sure you've heard the phrase, or other people in this room have heard Saidiya Hartman's phrase, critical fabulation. It's a very...
I like how that sounds.
It does sound good, doesn't it, right?
Hey, get the word fab in it, so it's already winning.
So Saidiya Hartman is a theorist of slavery and of the Afro-American past, and she talks very much about the afterlives of slavery. And one of the things that she has has contributed to the conversation among historians recently is the silences in the archives. And so for her, critical fabulation is a way of talking about using the imagination, but using it from a place of really careful research, so that it's not just about making up a story, right? It's about filling in the archive that we never are going to have, because the archive as it is built in order to do the work that in order to erase the presence of slavery. It's built so as to tell a story that erases Native people, that erases enslaved people, that situates them to the side of the story, right? So I wanted to hear you talk a little bit, because you said a couple things. You talked about the importance of visuals and being able to visualize the past, and that without like a man or a woman's face in our head, that we are unable to sort of believe that Black people were there. So I thought that was fascinating, because I've spent a lot of time talking to myself and to others about about why I am committed to doing archival work, even though the people that I want to write about are not in the archive. So my work is to say, those women are there, but they're not in the archive. So what does that do? So I haven't been focused on visuals. So I'm really interested in, I know you come to this first as a visual artist, right? So I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about why the visual is so important to you as you are engaged in this project of critical fabulation.
Yeah, great question. Well, I think that we're leaning more into a visual culture, period. I would just say that's something that is a global phenomenon. And I think that when you're having a conversation with young people in particular, that it's almost like you can't blame anybody for privileging the people that have the images. It's like, how do you say, hey, like, let's talk about this person who I can't show you ever, versus you've already seen all these other images and statues of people that have been documented and have been mythologized and have been presented as heroes. And I'm not saying that those things should not exist. I'm just saying we have to like add to the conversation. And so I think that, whether it's like a writing prompt or it's a riff off of, I think that if people are not able to give some assets to begin to work off of, you can't expect that person, just based on the human, psyche, to give them equal weight. It's just, I don't think that it's psychologically possible to only hear about somebody's story and give them the same kind of like care and consideration as somebody whose image you've seen time and time again. And I remember one of the things that Andy Warhol said that was super simple was like, I love doing things multiple times. The more you see it, the more powerful it is. And there's other artists who, like street artists, who follow the exact same ethos. They keep putting the same image up over and over and over again, and the more you see it, the more powerful it is. And if you never ever see a Catalina or a Caesar or a Domingo ever, it's hard to then say that person was important. They're important where they at. Yeah. That's just the kind of culture that we live in. And I think that we also have seen what happens when those images are not part of the conversation. And so I think that everything I've shown you today was created by an artist. If it's a map, if it's an etching, it's the artist of that moment, the artist of that day is like, okay, this is how, like the engraving that the gentleman mentioned, that's a crafts person, that's an artisan. Somebody chose to make that image, and now we have it as our reference point for what happened in that person's time period. And I think that specifically as people of the Black diaspora who are struggling and living with this lopsided view of our own lineage and our own background, because of this power structure that's decided that it doesn't behoove them to elevate our humanity, I think that we have the privilege and the purpose to get on a time machine and say, you missed the spot.
Absolutely. But I think you're also saying, you're saying that by using that privilege to fill in those gaps, you're also saying something about the process of erasure. Right, because you started out by saying that we need to add in, but it's not just adding in, because the adding in is staking a claim and is saying that there's power in the process that eliminated us from the archive and that eliminated us from the visual, or populated Black people in the visual only in very particular ways, right? So that the other place is you see more, you see images of degradation and images of suffering and pain that are kind of on the edge of the archive, but you don't see the images of people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a church group I gave a tour to from my hometown, Pittsburgh, and I had them down by the dock, and I was talking about Black people who worked in the commercial hub of New York City during the hub, during the transatlantic slave trade, and how the way that the company worked, the way that the system worked, was people who were enslaved in New York were these highly skilled urban enslaved people who lived in their masters' homes, and principally the people who could purchase Black bodies were the ones who had the most money, and they lived, ironically, in the best neighborhood houses on the east side of the island, and the things that they did would be comparable to being like an engineer now. And I also talked about how they began to organize and plan and plot to resist enslavement, and I mentioned how in order to be enslaved at that point in time and live a life in New York, that you were more than likely, bilingual or a polyglot or a polymath and had multiple skills. And I remember watching one of the little girls' faces just kind of staring at me, and she was just kind of I always wondered why we didn't fight back, because the images of resistance problematize a lot of the narratives about white supremacy, or problematize the idea that the first time people organized and fought for freedom were the slave owners of tobacco fields or printmakers. And so I think that we can discuss what's happening in the 1600s, but I think it becomes even more important to look at the continuity of that particular body of images as they evolve and show the complexity of the slave trade, of commodities, of economy, and how Black bodies have been a very important part of all those different dynamics. And it gets bigger because if you're telling a story of the Black diaspora, it all affects New York, but you got to talk about what's going on in Saint Domingue, Jamaica, Barbados. It's all connected. And so I think that making it visceral, it begins to at least create a conversation where someone mentioned it. She says, I think lady said, that person isn't Black to me. That's a legit point of view. That's the beauty of art. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Well, thank you for correcting. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, understood. Thank you. For the record, I've been corrected. She asked the question. But the point is that if you create the body of images based on research, but also own, if you're telling a story over a graphic novel process, and you honor that you're filling in some of the gaps based upon, creative writing, then you at least create something to have a conversation about. Even it's I don't think that might not necessarily be the way Domingo looked. It's okay, well then sure, but we have something to talk about.
Exactly. So for me, one of the most important things about the time period that you're talking about is how many women were enslaved on those ships. So I had two questions for you that are really about colonial New York. One has to do with the half freedom. So for those of you who don't know, there's this moment when a group of these enslaved but relatively autonomous men petition the board in 1642, I think, asking for freedom on the basis of all the work that they've done for the Dutch West Indian Company, and they're given freedom, but they're for themselves and their wives. So that's one thing. So the men are named, but the women are not, and except the adults are given freedom, but the children are held in slavery. And that's where that phrase, the half freedom, comes from. So I'm just really curious to know whether you talk about that on your tour and how you talk about it. And then, two-part question.
I love a two-part question.
As far as I know, by 1705, the majority of enslaved people in the city, in Manhattan, were women. It was 55-45 or 60-40, and that men were enslaved in Kings County and Queens County, where there were male majorities, but in the city they were female majorities. So one of these moments of erasure that's so fascinating to me is how when we get to 1712 and 1744. No mention of women as rebels, as conspirators, as potentially dangerous, even though they are in the majority of those Negroes and other slaves. So,
yeah, I mean, 17. I'm gonna work backwards into the first question. One of the people I talk about on 1712 rebellion is a woman named Sarah who's pregnant, and I talk about the idea of like visceral, like what's freedom. And I just say, this is 1712. This is before like many of the founding fathers are even born. But you have a pregnant woman who either has like an axe, a gun, or a sword, who is willing to be a part of setting fire to an orchard and fighting against the slave master class. And for me, like a vision of an armed pregnant woman is more of a visual of freedom than like a slave master on a horse, And so when I talk about these images that are missing, that's often an example that I use when I talk about the 1712 rebellion, which happens less than 6 months after the initial first Wall Street slave market or the meal market is built. And I talk about the environment with like Elias New and the baptisms, etc. I would love to talk to you some more about the shift of population of gender to being predominantly women, because that's something that we could I'd love to find out some more about where those records are, because that's part of always being a student and learning more. I'd love to find out some more about that information. But I do think that I'm very intentional about making sure that we elevate women's stories, specifically as we're elevating stories of the Black diaspora, as well as making sure we find out as many ways we can talk about who's from different First Nations. And right now, I struggle sometimes finding names of people from First Nations in 1640s, 30s, 20s.
Well, and also because from the women who are part of that that first group of people who are collectively set free, the only names that we know of those women are women who then tried to protect their children by placing them in some sort of indenture. So it's only a few women who emerge in the courts because they're trying to, their child who is still enslaved, they're trying to kind of connect them through baptism and godparentage or other things to free people to protect those children. So, but otherwise, those women's names. So Dorothea Angola, and there's a woman whose last name is Portuguese. Are again, it's like these glimpses you have in the archive of what they are doing to try to expand what freedom is, because if their children aren't free, they're not free, right?
And then you have widows who are some the first landowners as well.
Exactly.
And so there are a number of women whose names are mentioned as landowners. And I think that's something to continue to look at and expand upon when you're studying this time period. And I often bring up Queen Nzinga as an example because, this is the kind of woman that is in the country where they're coming from. And she's a warrior queen. And so if we're looking at this warrior queen, yes, she's phenomenal and she's unique, but consider the kind of culture that people are coming out of that's going to create things like capoeira, that's going to go to Brazil, and people like Catalina here in New York getting married and become a landowner. Different ways of seeing that women who might not have the word feminism in their vocabulary are I need mine.
And it's also, the other thing that's so important is this moment in the 15th and the 16th century where we know what's happening in Congo, Angola. We know the relationship between Portuguese missionary attempts and diplomacy, efforts at diplomacy, and we know therefore who these people are,
Right.
who end up and that's important. I mean, again, I think I'm totally with you, like, to say that these are enslaved people, but we know where they are coming from, we know what they believed, and we know what they experienced in a really particular way that's not a generalizing way.
Right.
You know,
It's very specific,
It's
and I
very
think that-
specific. And I think that it's part of the problem of the way we teach American history, that students find it so difficult to go like 1490. What are you talking about?
America didn't exist back then. Why are we studying it?
Exactly. So I think that part is so important.
Can I lean back into the one question about half-breed? That was the
Oh,
first
yeah.
question you asked. I take a slight umbrage with when people, and I know you're not doing it, so I'm not trying to start an intellectual spat that I would lose with you. But I often find people say they weren't really free, right? They were half free. It's like, okay, let's stop on that for a second. So let's say you are a person right now in 2017 and you're 1,000% free. Okay, let's ask about, how much land do you own, right? Let's also ask questions like, from whence did you come to get to a place where you are a landowner and have a neighborhood that's twice the size of Soho? And let's also ask, what are you doing right now with your 1,000% freedom to help people who are not free? And so if your half freedom means you have to still fight for your child's freedom and fight for your neighbors or your friend's daughter's freedom, that sounds like, for me, that half freedom has more agency because they're continuing to still strive to expand freedom versus say, I'm good. And I think that's something that we struggle with now when people are like, we know about the prison pipeline, we know about the prison population, we understand what's going on with like police brutality or sweatshops or, things happen, the economic violence of the day. And we're like 100% free, but not necessarily fighting for somebody else's half freedom or no freedom, but then want to somehow downgrade somebody else's achievement because they still have to fight and find ways to expand freedom for their family members. I think that that's something that we could actually borrow and say, so we're not half free, but who are we fighting for?
I think that's fair enough. I just think, to me, what's important, and then I'm totally going to open this up, is that part of what the Dutch do is they're expanding their own sense of largesse. Yes, we will confer freedom on you, but you owe us rent on yourselves. You have to give us a hog and a certain amount of
some peas and some corn.
Exactly,
a fat hog,
and a fat hog, and your children are still ours. Like that. To me, you're right. It means that that community is faced immediately with the slipperiness of freedom in the 17th century and understand it. So I would say those men and women are absolute. They know what freedom is, right? Because they're working to expand its confines. But I think that both of those things are important. That the conferring of freedom it's an early step in that way that a sort of liberal notion of white progressives gets rooted. Oh yes, we will give you your freedom.
We're going to nerd out
You've
some.
been so good.
We should nerd out some more on that.
You've worked so hard.
Because there are some people who have, there's recorded people purchasing other people's children or adopting people.
No. I know. I'm just saying that on the Dutch side, there's something. You know what I'm saying? But I do think I agree with you that those folks, those men and women who obtain that freedom, work to expand it immediately, but they're also fighting a little bit of a losing battle, right? Yeah. And so it's that freedom is a terrain. It's a
chess game.
Exactly.
And it's never
or
over.
a battlefield,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to stop and I'm going to open it up to you all.
Or
I
come
might
back.
I might jump back in.
Yeah,
Exactly.
please. This is
I'm
great.
not totally relinquishing my mic.
So I really appreciated in your talk how you incorporated your nerdy identity into your discussion of history, and I'm wondering how you specifically decided to make a graphic novel. Like, why that format?
Yeah, I think that the graphic novel is become more supple as a genre. I think more than any other like printed book or like printed genre, I think the graphic novel has proven to be more just like bendable. I mean, you find all types of histories finding their way into the graphic novel format. And as we become more of a visual culture, I think that it becomes something that is almost like it's like almost like our form of theater to a certain degree. Granted, we have media, and so nothing's going to trump that. But when it comes down to actually having like books that everybody is sinking their eyeballs into, I think that the graphic novel affords itself in a way that even like, you know, young adult novels that are like chapter books don't. Like you might hear like, oh yeah, this book is great, my daughter's reading it, but like you're not. But like graphic novel, like you're fighting over it. You know what I'm saying? And I think that also looking at the success of entities that have published comics and graphic novels for decades and then began to leverage those assets into cinema, I think that is also that portability is something that's very, I think, smart to consider, like for like legacy planning. And I'm not going to be around forever. I hope I'll be around for like a nice little minute, but I would love to be able to like get this graphic novel collection out there and in the world, because at some point in time, you know, this could of course be like leveraged into other kind of assets like cinema, films, or like Broadway, because when you have the visuals down and the story, and you have like a fan base that gets your universe that you've created, then you can begin to like leverage that into all types of different ways that can reach new generations in the future. And once again, the visuals being so critical, I think that there's something about showing young people this is representation of that time period, and to see yourself represented and to encourage people to be a part of the process. I think it's just like, you know, we're still very much in the beginning process, but I think that how we're doing a graphic novel is really like, it's kind of breaking the mold a little bit because it's so inclusive. Just so you could have like 100 people in like one book. And by the time you do enough books, it's like, you know, it's like a yearbook of the people who might be living at a certain time period, which makes it, once again, an artifact for the future. So I think the graphic novel is an amazing platform to reach a lot of different types of people. And then you have the assets, the visceral assets, all types of ways to like incorporate notes in the back and maps. So I guess I'm just a fan of the format.
It's also a format that's being adopted in classroom use a lot. I'm thinking of Abena and the Important Men, which is a graphic novel that's about a moment in East African history, right? Mm-hmm. And it's about colonialism, and it's being taught at the university level in world history courses.
Yeah, there's a whole like curriculum in the back of it.
Exactly, so that you have that capacity as well, which I think is huge.
Yeah, I mean, God willing, it'll all happen.
So I came to my interest in memory and landscape through my work as a skeletal biologist on the African Burial Ground Project.
Amazing.
And the experience of children, because of the shift to importing enslaved women and children because of the fear of revolt, also led me to look at the skeletal record in terms of trying to understand if we could see in the burial ground population what it meant to have been born free and then enslaved as a child in Africa, and then forced to migrate to the Americas, having this complex lived experience possibly through the Caribbean before coming to New York, dying in New York. But what did that also mean in terms of being able to see children who died as children, as infants? Do you have storylines in your walking tour and in your graphic novel that tell the stories of children? I'm thinking about what that meant to be 6 years of age was found to be a particularly stressful time because that's when many of the children were sold away in New York. So I was wondering, because you have so many children also asking questions and on your tours, what role the stories of young children play in your graphic novel.
Would you mind telling me your name?
Autumn Barrett.
Autumn, thank you.
Yes.
I remember your name. That's a great question. I think that part of our creative process is we're telling a series of 5 different stories, and we're releasing them like a chapter at a time, and we're creating our own publishing house to do it. And so we're like, the first book, Other Side of Wall Street, is like 11 chapters. And the first chapter is the first one that we're working on. And so we have time to flesh out a story, have the outline, but then also have some correspondence and feedback with how these stories are landing, similar to how comics operate. So we're kind of like on the edge of flirting with the graphic novel and comic form by the timing of how we release it, which is like the best of both worlds for us as publishers and creators. But the story you're talking about, I feel we're going to get there more as we get past Other Side of Wall Street, because this is more like 1600s and giving you more backstory to the lived experience of people who come from the Congo at a time when Angola has been partitioned about 80 years before they're taking off of the ocean. And so by building up their story, you begin to have a whole different appreciation for family life and family struggle when you begin to get into the time period of New York, where you would have more people being brought to New York enslaved, because you don't really begin to have major shipments of people enslaved in New Amsterdam until like 1653 and 1664, like the 2 big slave ships that come to New Amsterdam. And so the culture of slavery is far different than this being like a hub for the transatlantic slave trade. So you're going to get to more of those stories into English New York than New Amsterdam. So, but you're talking about an amazing protagonist, an amazing story to cover, and part of having conversation and listening and being humble about ideas is you're really inspiring me to even think about those characters, which would not manifest in our story until like 2018 sometime, but it's a great character to consider. So thank you, Autumn.
Hi, thank you both so much for that talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what I saw as like a history of emotions, right? Especially with the images from the graphic novel, the slave ship, thinking how would have people felt, the image of the angel. And it seems that a part of erasure is also just an erasure of emotions, right? Like we know probably the million shades of things Abraham Lincoln is supposed to have felt, right? But in terms of the histories you're talking about, I feel like you're kind of, there's something really crucial there. And then I wonder if you can also talk about how would history of emotions relate to this idea of conversation, or how does that lend itself for conversation? And I noticed you called that historical fiction. So why would that be historical fiction, let's say, in the way that, and not in the terms of just an intuitive way, but how do you see that as historical fiction? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you. And your name?
Tova.
Tova?
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that emotion is a very important way to experience history and to process history. I feel like memory is often in these buckets called emotions, and that's part of why emotions are so important for us as a human experience, is to recall. And if you don't have emotions, you might forget how something felt, because they're like one and the same in many regards. And so if you can begin to imagine and become empathetic to somebody else's lived experience outside the archive or outside of somebody else's perspective, you can say, all right, I can imagine that. It can begin to sit in your body and become, once again, part of Tova's experience. It's not about what I'm telling you. You're considering these things, and it's a part of you're now putting it in your body. And then that can become part of your perspective or how you can imagine things, and it can expand your humanity into the next situation. And so I think that I haven't quite considered it, quote unquote, a history of emotions. I like that. But I do think that it's important to experience these stories that are, deep into the fade to black from an emotive standpoint. So it's not just like, the didactic of this happened, you're reading about it and you're, distanced from it. But like, imagine being that person, and then imagine walking where that person would have lived when you're walking out of this building today. And so I think that kind of connects to the historic fiction part, because as you begin to imagine feelings and emotions, like voices begin to like come through. And at one point in time, I did the Kickstarter for this graphic novel in 2015, and my initial script was just to write specifically about the history that I could find and prove, and not to actually add anything that was fictive at all. And then I gave myself like a writing retreat that turned into a sleep retreat. I slept for like 4 days, because during the Kickstarter, I gave walking tours like 5-6 times a week as like a little come on the walking tour for free. If you like it, please consider giving to our Kickstarter. And that kind of helped the project get more audience. But when I was done with all that, I was tired. But when I did, have these dreams and slept and thought about the writing process, something just kind of hit me, like an idea that I didn't come up with. It just kind of like hit me like a apple being thrown at me from across the street. And it was like, let those voices come through. Like, don't fight it. Don't say, oh, I can't prove someone thought that way. I can't prove someone said that. Or I don't know if they had a friend named so-and-so. It's like, but if you allow the voices and these images, and if you give them life as a writer, and then give them a visual as a character, but own that. Like, don't front like it's not something that you made up, but can say, all right, from this map, this timeline, these notes, these are the things, and here's the sources. So you can have all that information there, but at the same time, you could begin to like tease out some of the things that you can't find. Like, I'm sure there was all kind of First Nations contact with people who lived in Land of the Blacks, because part of why they got the Land of the Blacks was to be a buffer zone, or from selfish reasons, was you're a buffer zone during this war that William Key had started in the spring of 1643. So there's got to be some type of like Wickwasek, Tappan, or Mohawk people who came through somebody's, backyard with like a side eye, like, you want to say something? And that's something that comes from the writing that can say, I don't know that happened, but I don't know how you have a community that expands from one side of the island to the other side of the island during a time of war, and you don't come across anybody who's from First Nations. That's a dynamic that's not known how it's going to play out. And for me, that's part of like what art is for. Like, you might not know that, but if you can write it and present it in a way that's plausible and meaningful, it can become a conversation.
But I just want to, the foundation of you can do that in part because you've done so much research. Like that's the critical part of the fabulation, right? It's not that you're just making up a story. It's that the story is so grounded in the archive, and it's so grounded in your very specific understanding of the history of this time and place, that it then allows you to have that moment where you let another voice speak through you, or you let yourself imagine what the kind of day-to-day encounters could have been like. But it's only real because it's grounded in all of this really specific history. So I just want to give you that. It came to you in a dream, maybe, but you had to first be exhausted from all the research.
We're friends.
Okay.
Wait till we're gonna geek out. Friends. No, there's one of my advisors from 2015 who teaches at Fordham now and was a PhD candidate in 2015. He would just say, like, similar to I think what Tova's question is. He was like just so you know, Kamau, be careful calling it historic fiction, because everything you're imagining everything that I've seen you've written, that is historic. Even though you add in fiction to like protect yourself from trying to say that happened.
Right.
He goes, the things that you're talking about, like, there's no way that those kind of things did not happen. So I would just say it's history. I was like, I feel you, bro. I'm just trying to like not, especially somebody who like doesn't come from from academia. I just want to own like, I this is what I know, and this is what I'm coloring in, and there might be other adaptations of it in the future. But
and for me, what I think about that is that I circle around. Like, I'm like, okay, so here's what I'm trying to get to, and here's the information that I do have from the archive. I circle around it, and then I circle back around and say, so if we know all of this, what else can we presume to have been the case? But you give your audience, through the graphic novel, through your conversation, you give them all of this history, and then you encourage them to think about what that means, right?
Yeah. I mean, ideally.
There's so many questions
Yeah,
back there.
sorry.
We got all the way in the back.
I'm sorry. Am I answering questions too long?
I'm asking questions too long. It's my fault.
Hi. So I kind of wanted to touch upon that last point you made, particularly about the First Nations and especially the Lenape here. And because whether you find any kind of archival suggestions, evidence of any kind of them not only as a warring faction, but also as political actors within New York itself. I mean, because we do know they never actually left completely. So I'm thinking, so kind of thinking, and particularly in how they might come into contact with enslaved and or freed people in communities, and perhaps even as co-conspirators of a certain kind. Just if that's kind of a direction you see your work going or have taken in the past, I don't.
1,000%. And your name?
Oh, Adelaida.
Adelina? Did I mess it up? Adelaida. Thank you. I find part of one of my personal measures of success with Other Side of Wall Street specifically, which leans more into like, the time period, coming into the creation of New York, is being able to offer not just like evidence or a storyline, but fleshing out how much this was the First Nations land prior to anybody showing up, and how there was agency that they had that clearly, even if you think about even, and I mentioned it, if you think about even the creation of the land of the blacks, there must have been a formidable enough of a threat to say, you know what, we need to create a buffer zone because we can't handle, what's happening right now. It's too much. It's overwhelming. And I think often we look back in history and assume and imagine that people that are First Nations are like not formidable enough to strike fear into people who are European and have guns. And often what you see happening with the Dutch is they're going to like lean on their English friends for help. Like, hey, it's getting hot over here, bruh. Here goes my address, come through. And I think that's an important part of the conversation to have. And I also think that above and beyond the military aspect, there are some good records that talk about the way people like Adrian van der Donk, who actually wrote a book where he is almost like native, like First Nations are like his muse. A lot of times people are like more intrigued by First Nations than by their own culture. And you see this interesting correspondence where the concept of American, the first people that were called American were First Nations. Like the whole idea of like us being American is almost kind of like a funny cycle, because the first time you actually see the word American being used a lot like that is people that are First Nations, and later on people that are, black or brown. But there's so much there to flesh out. And so I think that the answer to your question is yes. I do want to flesh those kind of stories out, and that also is part of why I think the fictive component does come in, because if the records on black people, if they fade to black, the records on like what particular Lenape, Wicwa sect happened, those, it's almost like that's going to fade to black even quicker. And so that definitely is going to be an exercise of imagination and also conversation. I've definitely reached out to people who are, give like different tours, like I think Evan Pritchard and a couple others, to make sure that I'm considering how these stories are manifest and building that into the mythology of the island. And so, yeah, that's like one of, personal milestones I want to be able to present is all the way down to having people that are First Nations to play these roles. And that's part of why this is like a definite process. But once again, imagine having all those things baked into the graphic novel where you actually have real people telling these stories with their very bodies. And I think that once again, that creates the conversation. It doesn't like end the conversation. It now begins a new conversation that we can have that brings more humanity to everybody's story, because New Amsterdam was like hella diverse, cosmopolitan, and there was lots of tension around where things should go, because many people who were settled here had they hated Kiev for starting out war with the First Nation. That's part of why he got kicked out on both sides, by his own people and by the company, because of how he handled and botched that entire experience. So there's a lot more to flesh out there that people understand. So I'm probably over answering it, because the simple answer is yes.
Oh, thank you. Can I just? Okay. All right. So my question's a little bit more kind of like biographical, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what you did during your time in art school, because just from what I've seen from this lecture that you've given in the talk and whatnot, you work both in like oral storytelling, but also in like the graphic novel and like the comic book, and I think of both of these things as like vernacular forms and also like alternative modes of like history keeping, history making, history production. So like I can sort of piece together that you're a photographer, but like what were you doing in that time? And then I had a second question, but I'll hold it for later. Like what kind of stuff, what was your formation?
Two-part go for it. It's the last question.
Okay. All right, so this is kind of a question about graphic novels, but actually more about comic books, which is, so I don't know, were you into comic books beforehand? Yeah, I'm assuming. So there's this Batman like special issue that came out in the 90s that was like about landmines and landmines like awareness that I think is really cool, specifically because it circulated in the US afterwards, but in the back it has this like weird like call to mobilize to children. It's like, listen up, children, if you're reading this, like 20 kids are going to die today, kids just like you, so here's who you write to and here's what you do. And I think of that as like a really interesting gesture, and like, obviously you're telling stories that, are kind of about an image of like Black excellence or Black success or Black, like an alternative image that we just don't see. And so they are like political inherently, like to our current time in their own right, but like, yeah, so my question is kind of like, how are you going to put something in the end of each chapter that's like, listen up, Black Lives Matter, like here's what's up, or here's your next step, or is like just the production in existence, like is that enough? Of like how are you tying it into like kind of current?
Your name again?
Malvika.
Malvika? Thank you. Love two-parters. So as far as like a form of like public service announcement or suggestions of actions to take, because I want the graphic novel to be very much in discourse with the time period that's missing from an aesthetic and an art direction standpoint, we're not going to contemporize it in that way. So I think that I want the experience with the graphic novel to feel as if you found something. Not like it's shiny and polished and it was done by a studio that had no, limit to the budget, but it'll be one color. It'll have the etching effect, images of ink, and we're designing the pages to look like they're worn, even though they're not. Because part of the idea we want to close with the aesthetic is, this history is missing. This happened. And we should already have these things. And so I don't want to begin to take the book and date it with the current. For me, that's the same thing as making it like 4-color. So it's not necessarily a political statement by not making a statement. It's more about the political statement being made aesthetically that this belonged in the past when the time happened, but it didn't happen. And so now we're taking our role as artists and creatives and, self-taught historians to say we're missing part of the conversation. Yes, I like graphic novels. And as far as like, I actually didn't go to art school in college. I have a really kind of weird, it's not too weird. I loved photography. As you know, growing up as a kid, that was like, I played with G.I. Joe, Transformers, and like my Kodak disc and like my like 710 camera, and just for me taking pictures and saving up money for my paper route to go get my pictures back. That was like the thing that made my heart beat the fastest, was being in the back of the car with like my change to go to the store and go get my pictures. And that delayed gratification process is part of what's baked into my sense of photography now, which is, even though you might shoot digital, the real payoff with photography is some delayed gratification, some type of like, all right, how do we take this image and keep building it and stretching it out, whether you're in a dark room or the light room? How does it become something different? And so that's kind of like why I'll photograph somebody, work with a designer, get the fashion down, we do the photo shoot, and then I pass it off to my designer homie and be like, I'm trying to have like X, Y, and Z. And then I get a file back. He's like, yo, dude, I'm so hyped, check it out. And it's like, that's like that feeling I had as a kid. So, you know, humans are that way. You know, we kind of repeat the things that make us happy. It's kind of weird. So I would say that that's the most, I guess, official education I got with photography was when I was in high school at an after school program. And when I talk to young people, I always remind them that, you know, I do push college education, but I say, please do not underestimate the power of little things like learning a photography class, because I've taken everything I've learned in college and beyond and put that behind photography because it made me the happiest. And I got a tour guide license that cost like $80, but with that tour guide license, I've been able to build a business and a platform bigger than I would have had just by doing the job that I got out of college. And so you can take everything and put it into, or put it behind whatever makes you happiest. But I actually I don't have a formal art education.
Thank you so much.